This war, this coming, February will be a 4-year-old war. So we're past the 3.5-year point mark now. We've already had a long war. What's going on here is that Putin understands that given the formidable defensive positions that the Ukrainians have been fighting from in eastern Ukraine, the fact that they've been fighting from these cities and that the Russians have to go into cities and reduce the Ukrainian forces in there. He runs the risk of the Russian army suffering massive casualties. And the last thing that Putin wants to do is see huge numbers of Russians coming back in body bags. Mearsheimer's point is blunt. Putin fears casualties more than battlefield losses. City fighting would shred his forces, and too many body bags could break his support at home. In simple terms, the war is slow because he can't afford a fast, bloody one. So what he's done is he's moved in a very slow and deliberate way, and he's substituted firepower for manpower in his strategy for winning this war. And when you do that, it's going to take much longer than if you just go charging forward with, frontal wave attacks. So it has taken quite a bit of time because he is minimizing casualties. That's why you want to remember that all these claims that the Russians are suffering enormous casualties, they're bleeding themselves white, are false. That's not happening because the Russians are behaving in a very deliberate way. The second thing you want to remember is that this is a war that's taking place on a long front. There are many points of contact along a front that's probably about 750 miles long, and the Russians will push in one area, and when they make a successful offensive, the Ukrainians invariably shift reserves to counter them, which weakens them in other places. The Russians then go to those other places, and they start Mearsheimer's point here is clear. Russia is trading time for lives, slow advances, heavy firepower, minimal manpower. It's deliberate, not desperate, and on a 750-mile front, every Ukrainian countermove opens a weakness somewhere else. In simple terms, Russia isn't bleeding out, they're outmaneuvering. So, the Russians are slowly but steadily pushing the Ukrainians back along the entire front, and they are bleeding the Ukrainians white. The Ukrainians are in deep trouble, and at some point they will crack. Do you give credence, Professor Mearsheimer, to the theory that the Russian version of the military-industrial complex, which includes the intelligence services and senior military people, want the war to go on for their own benefit, just like the American military-industrial complex wants the Ukraine war to go on for their benefit? I mean, stated differently, do you sense any adversity between the sort of liberal attitude of Foreign Minister Lavrov, re-establish normal relations with the West at a number of points, and the FSB, let's curtail the use of cell phones because they might be in the hands of Ukrainian and MI6 Ukrainian, and Intel and MI6, and we got to keep fighting this war for a long time. The point here is stark. Russia's slow push is draining Ukraine, not itself. Step by step, the front moves and the attrition piles up. Eventually, something breaks. And about the idea of Russia's own power circles wanting the war to drag on. That's classic military-industrial tension. Diplomats look for off-ramps. Security agencies look for control. In simple terms, one side wants to end the war, the other wants to manage it. Don't see any meaningful evidence. The military-industrial complex in Russia wants this war to continue, or even that the military-industrial complex in the West, or the military-industrial complexes in the West want this war to continue. I think even without the war, countries end up spending lots of money on defense. The Europeans are committed to increasing their defense budgets regardless of what happens in Ukraine, because they've portrayed or they've convinced themselves that the Ukrainians, that the Russians are this mortal threat that they have to deal with over the long term. But more importantly, I think the political elites are in charge in every country, not the military-industrial complex. And I think the political elites in every country would like to end this war. Of course, the message here is simple. This war isn't being driven by weapons industries. It's being driven by political fear. Europe has convinced itself Russia is an existential threat, so defense spending was always going to explode, war or no war. And that's the real irony. For all the talk about shadowy military complexes, it's the political class that's steering the ship. And they're the ones desperate to end this before it spirals beyond they. Russians want to end it on their terms, and the Europeans and the Ukrainians want to end it on their terms. And the fact that their terms are irreconcilable is what making this war a long war. It's not the fact that the Mick in each one of these countries is insisting that the war go on and on. Do you detect any deleterious domestic consequences to the long war, which is now, as you say, in its fourth year? Where inside, in Russia, no. I think that Putin has waged the war in a way that has kept the population satisfied with his conduct of the conflict. I don't think he's caused himself significant problems on the home front. I think at this point in time, almost everybody in Russia understands that the West is a mortal enemy. It's hard to miss that basic fact. And I think that almost everybody in Russia understands that Ukraine in NATO is an existential threat to Russia. The war isn't long because of industry. It's long because both sides want totally different endings. And inside Russia, the opposite of collapse has happened. People see the West as a threat, so support has only tightened. In simple terms, the longer the war lasts, the more Russia's public rallies behind it. So I think the basic goals of the war, cut in a way that allows Putin to have much support or continue to have much support from below. And with regard to the conduct of the war, as I said before, Putin is doing a very smart job in terms of how he's waging the war, because large numbers of Russians are not coming back in body bags, and he's also not drafting people and throwing them into a meat grinder. The people who are fighting on the front lines are volunteers, and when you have volunteers fighting, they're not dying in large numbers, and the cause is considered to be legitimate. You're okay. And I think Putin is in a very good political position in terms of his domestic audience. President has stated several times, as recently as earlier this week, that though the United States arms are going to Ukraine, the United States is not paying for it. That is, the European governments are paying American arms manufacturers and getting licenses from the State Department to ship it directly from the manufacturers in the US to Ukraine. Is that true? And if it is, where are the Europeans getting this money from? Well, it is true that we've basically stopped sending weapons that we pay for to Ukraine, that the Europeans have to buy those weapons. They have to pay for those weapons and then give them to the Ukrainians. But the key point, which you were getting at, is that the Europeans don't have the money. The logic here is straightforward. Putin stays politically safe because he's keeping casualties low and relying on volunteers, not mass drafts. That keeps the war legitimate for his public. And on the Western side, there's another problem. Europe is now weapons bill. But the punchline is simple. They don't actually have the money to sustain this. It's estimated that leaving aside the weaponry that the Ukrainians need, about $100 billion a year to wage the war. And the Europeans are trying to figure out where they can get $200 billion to give the Ukrainians to fund this war for Ukraine for 2 more years. And they don't have the money. Well, they'll have to steal it. Where will they steal it from? The Russian deposits in European banks. Yes, that's exactly right. That's what they're trying to do. But it's so far proved impossible to do that because the Belgians, who have the money in their banks, are unwilling, because of the threat of being sued down the road, to allow that to happen. And there are other countries like Italy, France, and Germany that have cold feet as well on this issue. So, it's not clear that you can get agreement inside Europe to steal this Russian mo. The long-term economic and political consequences of doing this. This part exposes the core problem. Europe needs money. It simply doesn't have funding Ukraine for 2 more years. Means finding $200 billion, and the only idea on the table is seizing frozen Russian assets. But even that is stalled. Too many European countries know the legal and political blowback could be devastating. In simple terms, they can't afford the war, and they can't afford the fallout of funding it either. So it's hard to see how the Europeans are going to be able to provide sufficient funding for Ukraine to continue this war. And when you marry that to the manpower problems that the Ukrainians are having on the battlefield, you read these reports in the mainstream media about the number of desertions in the Ukrainian army. 20,000 people deserted in October. The estimates are that there'll be 100,000 desertions this year. This is an army that's on the ropes as it is, that's badly outnumbered as it is. And when you throw in those fantastic numbers of desertions, and then you marry that to the fact that we can't support or the Ukrainians can't support themselves financially, it's hard to see how the Ukrainians can possibly stem the tide. What this really shows is a double collapse happening at the same time. On one side, Europe simply can't bankroll the war anymore. The numbers don't lie. If you need $200 billion and no one has it, the strategy falls apart before the battle does. And on the other side, Ukraine's manpower crisis is turning into a breaking point. Tens of thousands deserting, an army already outnumbered, and projections of over 100,000 desertions this year. That's not a shortage. That's a structural failure. Now, here's where this becomes unavoidable. Even if Europe found the money tomorrow, it wouldn't fix the fact that Ukraine is running out of people to fight. And even if Ukraine solved the manpower issue, it's still the financial collapse. In simple terms, you can't sustain a war when both your wallet and your army are emptying faster than you can fill.